So one of the things that we should talk about this week is the idea of constructs. And so constructs can be a tricky idea, especially when you're first learning about them. Typically, when we think about measuring something, we think about what it is that we measure is actually reflecting that thing that we're interested in. So for example, if we're interested in watching our weight, then what we might do is step on a scale and measure our weight in pounds, and those go up and down, and that's directly related to how much extra, weight or fat we might be carrying. So that's a pretty direct measurement for us. Although sometimes, especially in psychology, the things that we're interested in aren't a concept that has a direct one-to-one measurement associated with it. So especially in psychology, we're interested in a range of different things that are kind of these fluffy, cloudy ideas. So things like personality, introversion, intelligence, quality of life, or anxiety. And so all of these things, you can't really define them. Everybody knows what it is. And most people would at least agree on certain components of what makes a personality or what or stands for quality of life. But one of the issues is that there's no one single clear way to measure that. And in fact, most people couldn't even come up with a definition for exactly what things like these more loose concepts might be. And this is actually what leads us to develop the use of a construct. So kind of an example that I have here on the bottom of the slide is, let's say that we're interested in looking at the construct anxiety. Okay, there's no one direct way to measure it. However, we do know that one of the things that causes anxiety is an upcoming exam score. Okay, we tend to say that we're anxious whenever we have a pending exam for us. And what we associate, if we're to associate emotions with anxiety, we might have things like worry, nervousness. And those are kind of still more cloudy, hard to grip onto concepts. Although one of the things is that people report whenever they're anxious is they actually have a racing heart rate. Okay, so this may lead people to say, okay, well, there are a lot of things that can actually make our heart race, but one of the ways that we can actually measure anxiety, especially since racing heart is one of the ways we typically explain anxiety, is that we can measure people's heart rate. And if we see an increase in heart rate, then what we can assume is that means that they're anxious. Okay. Now the key thing to keep in mind here is that increased heart rate doesn't necessarily mean that they're more anxious, but it makes sense that we could based on our construct of anxiety and how we define it in this particular case, that you would expect that increased heart rate should occur if people were more anxious. Okay, so this is the idea of a construct. It's a very rough concept. There's not a firm, solid example of it. And so we have to really try to explain to other people what we mean whenever we talk about some sort of a construct. And so one of the ways that we do that well, actually, to step back a little bit and kind of take a class from this example, one of the things that I do is I don't give you tests just because I'm a mean-spirited person, but the purpose of tests is really to understand or to try and find out or measure exactly where your knowledge for the material that we discuss in this class lies. Okay, and then hopefully the grade that you're assigned at the end of the semester reflects how well you learn the material that we talked about. Now, I can't really go into your brain and measure anything that tells me how much material you've learned during this class or how you performed in this class. Instead, what I have to do is try to come up with proxy measures that will allow me to assess your understanding of the material and how well you can work with it. And so one of the ways that we do this is exams, or create exams and give exams to people. And the hope is that even though we don't have a direct measure of that, by asking you a bunch of questions that are related to the material specifically that you've learned during whatever unit of the class the exam covers, that we should be able to tap in and get some understanding of where your level of understanding lies as far as what we've talked about in the course. Okay, now again, as you can see here, there are a lot of arguments that can come out of whether this is a good or a bad measure, especially if your professor writes a really bad test. But the key thing here is this is a construct, how much knowledge you have from your course. And one of the ways that you can measure that is by asking a bunch of different questions about that content and seeing how well or how often people can accurately answer those questions that you've provided. Now, anytime that we're dealing with constructs, especially since these are more loosey-goosey ideas, it becomes really important for us to do something called operationally define them, or to come up with an operational definition. And an operational definition is really just here I define as a procedure for indirectly measuring and defining a variable that cannot be observed directly. And what do I mean with that? Well, it's a very clear and precise definition of how I'm defining the particular construct that I'm interested in. Okay, so one of the things that seems a little silly, but it highlights this point really nice, is that I was working on a research study where we were interested in looking on people's eye blinks and the number of eye blinks that they did in a minute. And this is, at least by some people to believe, to be a proxy measure for what dopamine levels are like in the brain. And we thought, okay, well, all we have to really do is record people's eye blinks, and it should be pretty easy to measure what an eye blink is, right? So we did that, and we started looking at the video and found out that actually people blink their eyes in a lot of different ways. And so what we needed to do was actually come up with an operational definition for that. In fact, I was really surprised by this, but it's amazing the number of times that people do what we call quarter blinks, where they only shut their eyes just a little bit, but it still looks like a blink. And other times that people just close their eyes and keep their eyes closed for up to about a second or a second and a half. So because of this, what we had to do was operationally define or spell out exactly what we meant when we use the term an eye blink. So kind of a rough idea of how we operationalize this is by coming up with a displacement of both eyes in unison greater than 2 centimeters. Um, and so here, anytime that we saw a displacement in both eyes in unison, with the eyelids closing on each other, greater than a certain amount, and then we went ahead and we counted that as an eye blink. If there wasn't a big enough displacement, or if the displacement was only in one eye, then we didn't really consider it an eye blink in this particular study. Hunger is like another really good example of this, where hunger, we all know what it is, we all feel it, but there are a number of different ways that you can define it. And so one of the ways, at least in the animal research world, that they define it is just the number of hours that the animal has been deprived of food. Okay, so let's say you're comparing a somewhat hungry group to a extremely hungry group. What might define those two groups or separate them is the number of hours since they were last given food. So, a somewhat hungry group might have not eaten for 10 hours, and an extremely hungry group might not have eaten for 24 or 48 hours. Okay. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that operational definitions really help us to communicate to other people exactly how we define something and how we're measuring it. However, one of the things that sometimes we get caught up in is that, our definition is not the construct itself. Okay, so here I provided an example of how we define eye blinks, but that's not what an eye blink is. Okay, that's not a definition of an eye blink. It's a working definition for us for the study of an eye blink, but it's not really an eye blink. Okay, same thing with hunger. While it's a way that we can express to other people what we mean or how we may have manipulated this, okay, hunger is not simply the number of hours since somebody was last given food. Okay, so operational definitions are good, but also realize that they are not the construct themselves. One of the questions that comes up is, well, how do we get anything done in psychology if we're always people are using different operational definitions? And here, I give the suggestion not to reinvent the wheel. A lot of times, people have worked really hard to come up with good operational definitions, and sometimes people come up with bad ones. And sometimes you need to revise current operational definitions. But sometimes people, have worked really hard to come up with a really good measure of it, especially in the case of developing some sort of survey or inventory when it comes to measuring things like depression. And so there's really no need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to come up with your own depression scale. There are a lot of really good depression scales that will allow you to measure what this thing that we call depression. Okay, so definitely, as you're coming up with your proposal ideas for this semester, don't try to reinvent the wheel unless you absolutely need to. A lot of times you can rely on measuring measures that are already out there that are good measures, and in addition to actually defining what it is you're interested, have already been tested to look at their reliability and validity that we'll talk about in different sections of this lecture. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit what an operational construct is and how we define it through an operational definition. But if you have any more questions about this topic, please don't hesitate to let me know.